We just have one last speaker for the afternoon session, and that's Michael Puett. But I don't think I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Oh, you are. You are.
Oh, I am. So he's an expert on ancient China because I had a chat with him earlier this afternoon during the lunch. And because of his multiple trips to China, he's now also become an expert on contemporary China. Okay, and today he will talk to us more about the kind of indigenous theories that emerge from China of our understanding of causality versus reality. So let's welcome Michael.
Thank you. Great, thank you so much. Am I speaking roughly loudly enough, too loud? Is that good? Okay, good. Please feel free to make motions if I'm speaking too loudly or too softly. So thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. It is tremendously exciting and a deep honor for me to be here. And of course, thank you all for coming. The discussion so far has been extraordinary. What I'll be talking about today, in fact, does concern Chinese philosophy. And what I would like to introduce you to are some ideas that have become important in Chinese philosophy dealing with these issues of notions of causality, reality, complexity, and trying to argue that they may have things to offer us today in terms of our understandings of these issues. Now, let me preface this immediately by saying what we'll be talking about today are not Chinese conceptions as opposed to Western conceptions. In fact, as we will see, many of the ideas that we would now term as prototypically Western, actually they appeared in the Chinese tradition too. Many of the ideas I'll be discussing today from classical Chinese philosophy have certainly appeared in the Western tradition. In fact, as a general rule, I would say it seems that there's never been any philosophical position that has ever arisen only once in world history. They always seem to arise everywhere. But what is very intriguing is noticing historically how certain ideas will become dominant, become ingrained in certain ways of thinking, and the implications. And therefore, the powers of doing compared to philosophy is you can see how ideas that, again, have tended to arise all over the place, but what happens when certain traditions become very embedded in certain ideas, others move into certain other directions, how have those debates played out, and it allows us to see in detail how, in this particular case, how ideas that have become very, very dominant in certain aspects of Western culture actually arose earlier in China too and were actively rejected and vice versa. And the project therefore allows us to see, over the course that we can now chart from several millennia, the complexities of how these ideas have played out, the implications of following one set of ideas as opposed to other sets of ideas, all of which I hope can help us, going through this, to enhance our own philosophical understandings of these ideas. Now, with that as a quick preface, let me now take you through some of the ideas that I think are of interest. Many of these ideas, as you will see immediately, resonate very tightly with ideas in complexity theory arising now in physics and biology, in China often focused as well on issues like ethics and socio-political theory. And it will help us, I think, enhance our understanding of these issues to see them within this broader context. So, first of all, to touch on something that has been a recurrent theme so far in our discussions about our tendencies to think in very restricted ways, to think in terms of objects following certain laws which then govern them, and working in terms of strict notions of causality, and then attempting to define reality accordingly. We've been discussing these so far in fields like linguistics, physics, biology. Let me simply note how common such ways of thinking have also become ingrained in our notions of ethics and socio-political theory. So let me just take us through some of the standard ways in America these ideas are spoken about, kind of commonsensical assumptions that become dominant, and we will see variations of this can be seen throughout the world as well. But first, the American version, because as I'll get to later, it offers a particularly intriguing permutation. So here are a set of ideas that are very common in America. How do I become a good person? I should look within, and I should try to find myself, find my true self. And once I find my true self, I should always strive to be sincere and authentic to who I really am, loving myself and embracing myself for who I am. Loving and embracing myself for my strengths, of course, but also loving and embracing myself for my weaknesses. If I happen to have a bad temper, well, that's just me. And I should love myself for who I am. And I should treat others the same way. loving them and embracing them as long as they too are sincere and authentic to who they really are. And as long as they are so sincere and are so authentic, then I should love them for being true to themselves. And we also will tell our students as well, if you do this, and so love yourself and embrace yourself for your true, authentic self, then think of your future life in the same terms, right? So once you've found yourself, plan out your life according to what is best for you, given your strengths and weaknesses. So for a career, for example, plan out based upon who you are, your strengths, how you will fit into the world as it exists in ways that will play to those strengths. If I just am someone who is good at X, Y, and Z, what careers can I play out that would play to those strengths and that would not be terribly harmed by my weaknesses, which again, I admit and love and embrace, but would want to avoid in terms of a career. And we will often do certain tests that will test what our personality structure is, what career, given who we are, we would fit well into, all of which assumes a certain set of things. First of all, that we are stable creatures with an essential true self that we should be sincere and authentic to, that it's a stable world out there, and the question is, how do we fit into this stable world? That stable world follows certain predictable sets of laws that if we understand them properly, we can figure out how we can thrive within that system based upon who we are. And if those are general assumptions about ethical issues, note many of the common assumptions about economic theory, political theory, follow much the same argument. So, economic theory. We, at our best, are rational creatures who will make rational decisions based upon who we are, our likes, our dislikes, what it is we prefer, and we will always be striving to follow our well, actually, I was about to jump again, to follow what is best for us. And therefore, in terms of economic theory, given that we are like this, the way you work out a theoretical structure is to say, if we incentivize certain types of behavior, how will that lead to people with their preference structure choosing certain things as opposed to other things? And once we've worked that out, of course, we can make macroeconomic predictions based upon those facts. What the incentive structures are, how people will tend to prefer or not prefer based upon who they are in their way of life, and on that basis, we can make large-scale predictions. Political philosophy tends to operate in much the same way, right? Political philosophy, at its best, we tend to think, is based upon individuals being allowed to make decisions for themselves. You then aggregate those decisions in terms of things like elections, and given how elections will play out, you will always therefore be able to create a society that maximizes what the majority of people will hopefully be wanting, with again regulations that will then prevent minorities from being overly injured by those decisions, but nonetheless at least in which those individuals will maximally be given what it is they prefer. And again, the negation of that would be seen to be any political structure that would impinge upon those individual decision-making structures. So a totalitarian regime, for example, would be bad precisely because you have people who would be controlling you, a state that would be censoring you and preventing you from making those decisions. So in short, both in the positive and negative form, most of our common assumptions, at least in America, but we'll see later, there are permutations of this that are now global, are based upon visions of a stable world, following certain predictable laws, stable individuals, that if we have proper understandings of the incentive structures, we can usually predict how things will operate. And again, the negative of this would always be things like people not being allowed to find themselves, choose for themselves what they want, choose their own profession, choose their own political leaders, etc. So everything operates according to certain sets of assumptions. Now, these are not uniquely American. They're certainly not uniquely Western. They also are not uniquely modern. I emphasize that last point, modern, because note too, when we go through things, as I've just done, commonsensical assumptions out there about the way the world operates at its best, it's usually put in contrast to something that we see that came before, something that we often will term the traditional world, in which presumably people couldn't do all the things we just mentioned. right? We often tend to think, they lived in a world in which they assumed it was not an open world that would be open to individuals choosing for themselves how to live, open in the sense of those individuals in aggregate choosing what types of a political system they would choose. On the contrary, they lived, we'd often like to think, in a closed system in which they thought the world out there was inherently harmonious. All humans could do is follow that larger harmony out there. The way to follow that larger harmony more immediately was to properly play your social role within a social organization that would itself be modeled upon that larger harmony. And therefore, as long as we properly played our pre-given social role, we would have a harmonious society in accord with the larger harmony out there. And therefore, we humans couldn't choose for ourselves what we wanted to do. All we could do is simply accord with a pre-given social reality, perceived to be, believed to be, part of a pre-given larger cosmic reality. And therefore, those traditional people, could not do what we now do. So, if those are very commonsensical ways of thinking in the world today, I will simply note a few opening points. First of all, there's nothing remotely modern about such ideas. You can trace similar ideas all throughout world philosophy. Moreover, and more directly importantly for where I'm going immediately, that characterization of a so-called traditional world is not only not new, the self-perception that this is how earlier people used to think has been around for a very, very long time, and moreover, it is empirically wrong. Not that there have not been people who think this way, but it's kind of ironic, as we'll see later, who perhaps could be plausibly seen as holding such views and who does not. And certainly, many philosophies that are called now traditional often were arguing precisely the opposite of what is often attributed now to them. And therefore, if we take a moment, as we will do here, look through some of these so-called traditional philosophies, look at what they are in fact arguing, they not only are different from our stereotypes, which is perhaps intriguing enough in itself, but more importantly, they offer, I would like to argue, a fundamental challenge to a lot of assumptions that are very common nowadays. A lot of assumptions about what makes us tick as human beings, a lot of assumptions about how we should be thinking about social and political worlds, and yes, how even we should be thinking about the larger cosmos. To make this argument, what I would like to do is take you through some aspects of Chinese philosophy, classical Chinese philosophy, absolutely something that we would often consider a traditional way of thinking, and note immediately what it is they're trying to get at, why they're getting at it, and when they are saying things that bother us and provoke us, we'll try to take a few steps to see what might be of interest in the arguments. So, to take you through this, let me give a few arguments, first of all about the self, then about the social and political worlds that we can come to inhabit, and yes, even about things like the larger cosmos, and try to, as I go, give you some of the details of the indigenous terminology, how they're arguing, why they're arguing, and hopefully as we go through some of this material, we can see why it might, perhaps, be of larger interest. But let's begin with the self. The self that oftentimes we, today, like to think we understand because we, for the first time in human history, are allowed to actually find it. So let's discuss classical Chinese views of the self. Not the only ones that arose. Actually, intriguingly, ideas that seem very prototypically modern were there too, and a lot of what I'll be discussing right now actually rose in explicit opposition to notions that there is some inherent essence to a self. So here is another view that arose. So these are texts from about the 4th century BCE. For the specialists, these are texts like the Xin Zimin Chu, for example, and a few others that I'll be drawing upon. For the few specialists, I'll be noting those as I go. For the rest of you, you don't need to worry about the Chinese terms I'll be throwing out occasionally, but I will try to give you at least enough to give you a sense of the flavor of this material. So here's a view of the self that becomes very prominent in the 4th century BCE in China. The self. We humans are a messy bunch of energies, a very messy bunch of energies. In fact, a good way to think of us is this mess of energies, and we're all equally messes of energies, as well as various faculties and qualities of energies, some of them very resonant, some of them very unresonant. And the way these energies operate, because we're messes of them, is we, messes, interact with other messes all the time. And when we interact with other messes, what these messes do is, in that interaction, they drag out from each other different responses. So, an example, someone yells at me, I get angry. In this terminology, someone yells at me, it drags out from me, it pulls out from me the energy, the Chinese term here is qi, the qi of anger. Then someone smiles at me. That drags out from me the energy of happiness. And therefore, our danger as humans, one of many that we'll see momentarily, is that we become very quickly passive vis-a-vis the world, simply responding to things around us, but not even responding, being dragged by things around us. And much of what we think we are doing over the course of a day is dependent upon immediate things that have happened to us just before. I am happy, I am sad, I am angry, or some bizarre combination of all of those based upon different people smiling or yelling at me. And much of what I will choose, much of what I will do over the course of a day, much of what I will even think I'm deciding over the course of a day, will largely be dependent upon the happenstance of things I've encountered. We're passive in the world. Now, that sounds bleak. It's about to get much bleaker, however, because the argument is that isn't even us at our worst. Because what also tends to happen from a very young age is that not only are we simply passive vis-a-vis the world, but that these responses fall into ruts or restrictive patterns. In other words, that person yells at me, and it draws out from me this energy of anger. Then someone else who, for whatever reason, emotionally reminds me of that person who yelled at me, also drags out from me the energy of anger. They might not be doing anything that really ought to have created such a response. It doesn't matter. They kind of emotionally resemble that moment. Then someone else will do something utterly irrelevant to me, but it will drag out from me an energy of joy, simply because of something else that reminds me emotionally of some earlier response. And over time, these harden. And so what we become over time are these rote, kind of machine-like creatures that are simply responding by rote to the world, really having very little to do with what is actually going on around us, but these have simply become patterned responses. This, dangerously, is what humans tend to associate as being their personality. I gave before an example. Oh, I just happen to be someone with a bad temper, or I just happen to be someone who gets angry at little things. From this way of thinking, that may be an accurate empirical statement right now, but that's simply because I have fallen into patterns of little things angering me. It's got nothing to do with anything inherent in me. These are patterns and ruts that we have fallen into. From this point of view, needless to say, the last thing in the world you would want to do is be loving and embracing yourself for who you really are. Meaning, from this point of view, loving yourself and embracing yourself for a series of ruts and patterns that you have fallen into. Deciding your life according to those ruts and patterns as to what your career should be, what your future relationship should be, a marriage partner should be, based upon ruts and patterns that you have fallen into. From this point of view, what you would want, presumably, is to break these patterns, to overcome these patterns, to quote one of the statements attributed to Confucius, overcome, or an even better translation might be conquer the self being understood as these patterns and ruts that we have fallen into. If this is your concern, we'll see momentarily, there'll be other concerns that others might have for you, but if this is your concern, how would you go about doing this? Well, intriguingly, one of the ways you go about doing this is to do something that we associate as being prototypically traditional, and therefore, from our typical way of thinking, bad. Something that tells us what to do as opposed to allowing us to choose for ourselves what to do. One of the things that would be argued is the importance of ritual, right? Again, we associate ritual as one of those things that socializes us into a way of being. It socializes us into a social role. It socializes us into some belief system about the larger cosmos. And therefore, we tend to think of it as something bad because it prevents us from being able to choose for ourselves what to do. Well, from this point of view, ritual actually is something quite different. Why do you do ritual from this point of view? You do ritual because ritual forces you. It forces you for that brief moment of time to become a different person. It forces you to break these patterns for that brief momentary period, to actively see the world from another point of view, to interact with those around you in a different way than you otherwise would. And the argument is, over time, what you're doing is breaking the self. In fact, that earlier quote I gave you from Confucius, the rest of it is precisely, you conquer the self by submitting yourself to ritual. Let me give you one of their examples, which is a telling one. Here's one of their examples of what they mean. There's a father and a son and a grandfather. This is a patriarchal society in which, of course, as in a patriarchal society, power is handed down from father to son. In the example, the ruler is the father. He is the ruler, of course, because his father, the grandfather, has passed away. He is now the ruler, and his son will eventually replace him. Now, you can imagine the implications of such a system. It doesn't take a lot of imagining, but let me just take you through it very quickly. This would be a system in which, by definition, there's going to be incredibly intense generational conflict, of one generation always succeeding the next generation, the higher generation always hopefully at its best training the new generation to take over, but we all know the kind of emotional patterns that humans can fall into, and so any failure of the younger generation to so perfectly be prepared for what is to come to them in terms of taking over power is seen as some kind of slight to the higher generation, or if they seem to be terribly effective, perhaps pushing out the higher generation out of some dangerous belief that they know better than we do. And of course, this can play out generation after generation. And so the ruler, who is the current ruler, of course, had a father with whom almost assuredly he had incredibly difficult patterns of interaction. Either playing out that father trying to support him, but being angry at his failures, or perhaps seeing him as being perhaps overly successful when he wasn't. The new ruler finally comes to power, finally is into his own, and yet has to deal with the after effects of his father, as well as all the emotional problems that have arisen therefrom, and moreover, has his own son to deal with, where, of course, that exact same set of concerns, emotions, tempers, anger, get thrown down to the next generation too. And it can go on generation after generation after generation. A typical set of emotional patterns. We know variations of this very well. Now, what did they do? Here's the ritual. The father and the son walk to the edge of the ritual space, and then they stop. And then they walk in. When they walk in, they have to walk in without blushing. Now, that may seem like a very odd point in detail to raise, but here's why. When they walk in, the father is no longer the father and the son is no longer the son. The son is actually his grandfather. And the son, except now he's not the son, he's the father's father now, walks to the central position of the throne and faces south, the ritually proper position that the ruler faces. His father, except now he's not the father, is his son. And as the son faces north, looking at the throne, looking at his own son as if his son were his father, looking at his own son as if he were subject to the ruler, who is his own son. Except, of course, it's not his son anymore, it's his father, and he is the son. When this happens, he, the father, who's now the son, of course, must pay proper obeisance to his own son, who is now his father. And his father looks down, in a very literal sense, at his own son, who, of course, is really his own father. His subject, except it's really his ruler. Then, after each plays its proper ritual role, they stand up, they walk to the edge of the ritual space, and then they walk out again. The father now is back to being the father, and the son is back to being the son. Within the ritual space, we are told, and this is quite explicit, within the ritual space, the relations between father and son are perfect. The son is perfectly filial to the father, and the father, of course, is a perfect figure helping to raise the son. And within that world of perfect father-son relationships, everything is perfectly harmonious. The cosmos is harmonious. The family is harmonious. And the family is even linked to the rest of the cosmos in its larger harmony, because heaven, too, is the father of the father, and the ruler is also the son of heaven. And so it's perfect father-son relationships both within the immediate family and connected to the larger cosmos, which is itself perfectly harmonious within the ritual space. Then they walk out. And then, of course, it's all back to being what it was. The father screams at the son screams back at the father has all of these issues with his deceased father, who of course is not a good father, but a dangerous ghost, and all of the angers that usually dominate the human relationships return immediately. And then they walk back into the ritual space. And that is only one of a huge myriad number of rituals they are forced to do on a constant basis. Why? Here's why. How do you break down these emotional patterns that dominate people throughout their entire lives, that become so rigid that they define how we experience the world, the relationships we build, everything we do? The way to break them down is you force people to break out of them. You force people to break out of those perspectives. In this specific case, what you do is you force each of these figures in what is within that kind of a society, one of the most dangerous sets of patterns, and you force each to see the world from the opposite perspective in precisely the most dangerous set of tensions that exist. So, the father, finally becoming the ruler, finally his own person, able to run things effectively, is forced again to realize what it was like, to remember what it was like, to be in the subservient position, staring at his own father with whom he had all of these issues, but now in a ritually proper way. Except, of course, it's not the father, it's his own son that he has to stare at, forcing him to realize the degree to which these patterns are simply being replicated. And the son, from a very young age, is equally forced to look at his own father, but now with him, the son, in the position of authority, learning from a young age the difficulty of being the figure in a position of authority, learning the difficulty of actually looking towards someone and having to instruct that person as to what to do, only now, of course, it's his own father. And each is constantly being forced, therefore, to see the world from the opposite perspective, and not in an abstract sense, but actually interacting with that other person precisely to break the patterns that usually dominate. And note, too, immediately, the ritual isn't socializing them into believing the world that exists in the ritual is a real world. It's precisely the opposite. The ritual is structured to prevent the participants from thinking that is the world they really live in. That's why it works. If you actually created a ritual that said, I will socialize the father into being a good father, so he has to walk into a ritual space and act like a good father, he might be able to convince himself that, yes, I guess I'm kind of like a good father. I'm sort of like I am in the ritual. I guess I'm not that bad a dad when I walk out of the ritual space. Note, however, there is no way in this situation that the father could convince himself he is the son of his own son. There is no way you could actually think what is going on in the ritual is reality. And therefore, of course, the flip side is the case. It also forces you to realize that reality, the world outside the ritual space, is a construct too. It is a construct based upon these patterns we've fallen into, and they are therefore changeable and malleable. And why do you therefore do ritual after ritual after ritual? Being forced constantly to break these perspectives? What you're being forced to do, and I'll use again some of the terminology of the texts, is actually to begin to again see the world as it, well, really is if you actually begin to break down these patterns and ruts that otherwise dominate us. Because what the world really is extraordinarily messy. And humans are extraordinarily messy. And once you begin to break out of these patterns that dominate you, the idea is you begin to be able to realize that simply shifting, even slightly, the ways you interact, the ways you're perceiving the world, the ways things you do begin to affect others, and you begin to catch that, you become better and better at sensing that. You become better and better at sensing the degrees to which little things you're doing are creating these patterns in those around you, the degrees to which you are perceiving the world according to these restricted ruts and patterns, and the degrees to which these little changes begin to open up other possibilities. And if you begin to do that, what you begin to see is that the entire world actually is extraordinarily messy. It isn't just individuals are messy, everything is messy. It seems stable, humans in the larger world, because we have fallen into such patterns and ruts that we perceive the world that way, act as if it is that way, but that is every bit as much of an as-if construct as these ritual constructs are. Every bit as much. And therefore, as such, it is all changeable. And what would this mean? Like, suppose, in other words, you begin to do this. Why would that be good? Let me take you through the implications, ethically, and then in terms of socio-political theory. But first, ethically, what it means is you as an individual would slowly cease to think of yourself as this stable self that you should be true to and loving and embracing for who it is. You actually become incredibly good at a daily basis through these rituals of breaking these limited perspectives, breaking the tendency we humans do of falling into these incredibly restricted ways of understanding ourselves and those around us, seeing the world as messy and acting accordingly. But then, of course, that raises the obvious question. What would acting accordingly mean if we are simply realizing that we and those around us and the larger world is in fact messy? Well, what it means is the following. You begin to realize if everything really is messy in this sense of the word, everything is inherently relational, everything we're doing is constantly affecting those around us and vice versa, and most of us aren't really responding to what things are, but are simply responding by patterns, you start becoming increasingly good at sensing what those patterns are in play and working on them and breaking them. Let me just give you one very mundane example from the text, but a telling one, and then get to the larger socio-political theories that come out of this. But here's just a very mundane example. So Confucius, this figure I mentioned before, seen as someone who is extraordinarily good at having spent his life doing these rituals, had become extraordinarily good at sensing the messiness of the world around him and the degrees to which humans don't perceive it that way. And here's a typical story. Confucius walks into a room, immediately senses all of the patterns of all the people around him. So he'll be talking to disciples, and there'll be a handful of disciples there, and he'll immediately sense all the patterns playing out amongst the disciples. And then he will just do something. He'll say something, he'll quote a line of poetry, he'll make a gesture, he'll make certain, use certain tones of voice, all of which are, because he's become so good at this, are designed, a word I'll come back to elicit certain responses that will break them from their patterns. These little things he will do suddenly will shift the situation and open up other possibilities because he's so good at breaking the patterns. In other words, he's so good at doing the equivalent of a ritual even when there's no ritual there to tell him what to do. It's as if he could simply sense the situation and say, okay, now you all will walk into this ritual space and here's what you do, except there's no ritual. He simply can do something at that moment that will create these breaks. But that, of course, only raises the larger question. Okay, so you create these breaks, you sense situations, but why? Here's where we get to the heart of it. Suppose then, someone, again, we'll stick with Confucius for a while, he's the prototypical example, is doing this. What would he do at a larger level? Well, here's the full argument. Imagine that this is actually what things like leadership consists of. This is what socio-political theory should consist of if you're actually successfully doing it in practice. The argument would be the following. What you become able to do is begin seeing the world in terms of these patterns and trajectories and breaking out of the dangerous perspectives that we tend to mistakenly use to interpret the world and actively begin doing things to break these patterns and open up possibilities. This is what you're striving to do. Let me give you some concrete examples, and then I'll give you the negative examples of what you would want to do if you didn't want what I'm about to mention to occur. And this will become an important part of the theories too. So here's a very concrete example. Suppose, from this point of view, you are in a leadership position and say you're about to run a meeting. How would you run the meeting from this point of view? The argument would be the following. What you would be trying to do is not to dominate the meeting in the sense of having your will imposed upon the proceedings, but you also aren't simply trying to do nothing in a literal sense and allow whatever is going to happen, because whatever is going to happen will be people's patterns and ruts playing out, and nothing remotely productive is going to come out of that. In fact, it can be chillingly predictable what will come out of this. You can usually predict perfectly in advance. This person will say this, that person will say that, this person will get angry, that person will give their usual speech, and you can always predict how the horrible meeting will play out. Rather, what you do, and Andrew mentioned the term before as well, is the term is wu wei. It's literally translated doing nothing, but it's not literally doing nothing. What you're doing is you're leading in this sense. You are leading by seeming to follow, but you are leading. And the argument is that you do exactly what I mentioned before. You sense, okay, this person's going to say this person will say that person will get angry, that will draw out this person's anger, that person will give the typical speech, and blah, blah, blah. All that I just mentioned. You sense that because, again, like the Confucius example, you're getting good at training yourself to sense these things. And then what you are striving to do is working the meeting, sensing as those patterns begin playing out, and sensing little things you can do, tones of voice you can use, ways that you bring up a subject, ways that you kind of smile, ways that you kind of look perplexed when different comments are made. And what you're doing is you're working the room to slowly shift and break out of these patterns and open up other possibilities. Then if you're effective, what you begin doing is when intriguing ideas begin developing, you're doing things to sort of encourage those ideas, work against people as soon as they try to knock them down again, and other people begin playing off of those ideas. People begin playing with those ideas. Someone starts getting angry, and you do little things to sort of, because you've got a sense for what sort of ticks them off. You do certain things to work against that. And what you're doing is creating a meeting in which people really begin interacting with each other because they are messy. And if you run it really effectively, you'll get these extraordinary things going on in the meeting, extraordinary ideas developing that no one person could have ever come up with on their own. And at the ideal level, everyone will walk out of the room having come up with these incredible ideas saying, wow, we together did all of that, which will in a certain sense be absolutely the case. But of course, they did it together because you led by following. You led the meeting but without anyone even being aware that you were leading the meeting. You weren't actively dominating anything, you weren't controlling anything, but the meeting would not have occurred that way if you hadn't actively done it. In other words, what you're trying to do is create these situations all the time. Mundane situation, a Confucius walks into a room and sees 4 disciples. A meeting, a larger socio-political order, where this is what you're striving to do. You're constantly trying to sense these larger patterns that are holding people back, and sensing ways that you can shift things, work things, alter things, open up other possibilities that you could not by definition have imagined in advance, but that you can play an active role in helping to inspire and develop and create. That's what you're trying to do. In short, you become someone who is constantly thinking in terms not of rigid structures and stable human beings. You're always thinking in terms of things like emergence. Things you can do to respond, how you respond effectively, how you create worlds within which you can respond effectively, create worlds within which others can respond effectively, none of which becomes predictable in an immediate sense because precisely you're training yourself not to think this way. Now, before I work out the full implications, let me also immediately give you the negative of this, because it's going to be very important for where we're going. If the goal is to train yourself to do this, to train yourself to see yourself and those around you as messy, the degree to which we tend not to live that way, and training yourself to actually actively begin breaking from these dangers that we fall into, the precise implication of that very same vision of what we are like as human beings can be taken in the opposite direction too. And a huge amount of socio-political theory coming out of China will also argue, yes, you can do all the things we just mentioned. In other words, your goal is to create situations in which you will have these emergences, in which new things will constantly be emerging because people are being broken from their patterns that hold them back. You can do the precise opposite, however. How do you control people if you understand that humans are like this? Do you try to dominate them and control them and censor them and overpower them? The answer, of course, is never, not overtly. Because from the same point of view, anytime you overtly try to control people, anytime you do the opposite of what we just mentioned, it will always create reactions because it's a relational world. Anytime you dominate someone, that will only breed resentment. You may win for a brief period of time, but you won't win for long. No one will ever tolerate being overtly dominated as long as they can fight back. And eventually, they'll be able to do so. Any overt domination always breeds resentment and anger. So how do you control people? You do the precise opposite. Instead of trying to create worlds where you're breaking these patterns and trying to create situations where there's new emergences occurring, what you try to do on the contrary is try to create flawlessly consistent worlds in which people will become so consistently doing certain things with certain ways of thinking and certain practices that their patterns become so embedded that they won't think, actually, that they're doing anything at all other than what is perfectly natural. To quote from one of the texts that will argue this very powerfully, they will live in a world that they will simply think of as being natural and spontaneous. In fact, it's been carefully articulated and worked out and developed such that that's the world they're living in, fully constructed, but they don't see it that way. An example I will give to my students constantly is to say, okay, let's go back to America, where we like to think, using the political theories I mentioned before, we are all free because by the tokens that we use that term, we are, right? We're all free individuals. We can choose for ourselves what we want to do. With our free wills, we can choose our economic decisions. We can choose our political decisions based upon our free will. If this other way of thinking is correct, no. Actually, what we really are these passive creatures that are simply responding to the world around us by sheer rote and pattern, And the very fact that we think we are rational creatures with our free will deciding things is simply because we have fallen into patterns where we think that's what we're doing, and we're not at all. An example I will give my students, very telling one because it shows groups that are catching on to this mode of human psychology. Example I'll come back to later too with a further implication, but here's a typical example of what we think of as kind of an economic decision being made upon our personal preference out of free will, right? I bought this watch yesterday. Actually, I didn't, it's just an example. I bought this watch yesterday, right? I chose to buy this watch because it's a watch that I liked, and that's what I did. Here's what really happened. I have a pattern where I stopped teaching on, say, a Thursday afternoon, my last class, and at 4 o'clock after my last class, it's been a long week, and what I do to calm down is I sit in my computer and I sort of go through different websites. Those websites, of course, know precisely what time I will go to them. I go to the exact same websites at the exact same day, exact same time, every single Thursday. That has been charted out. My patterns, therefore, become known. It's also been charted out that when I say go to this website, I tend to be drawn to things on this side of the web page, and I tend to be drawn to things in red, and at this exact same time, feeling calm after teaching my last class, I consistently bought things that were in red there. Those things I bought are part of my same patterns, and therefore that information is sold to an advertiser who will put up a watch that fits perfectly with the aesthetic choices I've made at the exact same time every single week for the past month. And lo and behold, I go to the New York Times website. There in red is this watch that fits perfectly with what I just bought last week. I click on it, and I say, I chose to buy a watch. No, I am a patterned, redded creature that is so easily manipulated that I chose nothing. From this way of thinking, there's no free will, there's no decision. It's simply someone, in this case, something, has been able to so perfectly find out my patterns that they just know what I will click. Needless to say, that example is used in advertising. It is also, of course, the case that every political campaign hires people who know how to run programs for this exact same thing. And increasingly, our lives are based upon people who become incredibly good, or computer programs in this case, that become incredibly good at simply knowing and therefore manipulating our patterns. Do I live in a free world? Well, by my standard, yes. In fact, I am totally manipulated in ways I don't understand because I'm so patterned and so redded. And most of what I do, if you think of one's life this way, you notice how much of one's life is simply playing out these same ruts and patterns endlessly. And if you want to control people this way, all you have to do is chart out their patterns, chart out the ruts, and it is chilling how manipulatable we are as human beings. In short, if we tend to think, well, the issue is, us at our best, free-willing individuals choosing for ourselves based upon who we really are, what we think is good for us in terms of watches we buy, presidents we elect, things we choose to do, careers we choose, etc. And the negation of that, sort of the bad side of that, would be people who prevent us from so choosing, people who would censor us or control us and dominate us. That's one way of viewing the world. From another way of viewing the world, we are patterned, redded creatures whose entire lives simply consist of repeating these patterns endlessly. And if larger organizations become incredibly good at keeping us in these same patterns and ruts, then we will so be, thinking that to be the natural world. But then again, as my earlier examples were hinting, the even greater danger would be no one would actively be doing this at all. We could do this to ourselves and think we're living in a perfectly free world. In fact, we have simply created for ourselves, passively, purely passively, a world in which we think we have free will, in which we think we are choosing everything, but in fact, we are simply playing out patterns in an incredibly, horrifically dangerous way. If that might be a possibility, then note the implications of really thinking through what it would mean to build economic, social, and political theories about this other vision of the self. A vision, I might add, that tons of psychological experiments are being done that clearly argue this is a pretty accurate portrait of what we are like as human beings. But even there, a lot of these psychological experiments are looking at things like the degrees to which we're malleable, being pulled by things all the time. We don't yet really have a vocabulary for this notions of patterns and ruts that just get repeated endlessly. But I suspect once we do and start doing psychological experiments to look at that, that is exactly what we will find. And then imagine if we start retooling some of our economic and political theories accordingly. Suppose a future economic theory, for example, or body of theories would be an even better way to put it, that wouldn't be assuming a stable world with free-willing individuals rationally making decisions based upon their preferences, and then making predictions based upon how those individuals in aggregate will act based upon certain incentive structures that are created through tax cuts, regulations, deregulations, etc. Imagine, on the contrary, a body of economic theories. Pieces of this are already there in behavioral economics, but only pieces. Imagine really taking this to its extreme. We are really trying to work out these patterns and ruts that have become embedded in people's ways of acting. And then what you're trying to do is either note the contexts which have created individuals to be acting in certain ways, that have created these aggregates of patterned behaviors of a certain type, in which people think, for example, that they are free-willing individuals choosing for themselves what to do over the course of a day, while in fact they are simply repeating these patterns. And then concretely you begin posing the question, not simply in terms of incentive and motivation, tax cuts, deregulation that will create certain incentive structures to incentivize people to do things, but you really begin concretely posing questions of, yes, but if we actively create X, what happens? What happens if we actively try to create different clusters of things that will begin creating these breaks? What happens if we actually begin intentionally trying to divorce different segments of sort of certain ways of thinking from other ways of thinking, and then intentionally try to create these breaks that actually shift people's patterns and ruts? And then quickly you move into a discussion of things like emergence, complexity. Imagine if our political theories begin focusing on these issues too, in which you're not simply looking at what we, I think, dangerously, reductively look at in our current political theories that have become so dominant, exactly like our economic theories, but you begin actively taking in these other aspects of human psychology, either fearfully, in the dangerous sense, or, I would obviously hope, in the more productive sense. And then if you begin thinking this way, let me note a few other implications too. Because if you really begin thinking this way, note how many things begin breaking down. Let me just begin briefly with something I mentioned earlier and then take out its larger implications. One thing that obviously begins breaking very quickly is suddenly these stories we've been telling ourselves now for a good 2 centuries, that we are now modern, we are free, we can choose for ourselves what to do, unlike those people in traditional societies who again did rituals that socialized them into accepting a pre-given order. Note the implications of taking some of these ideas seriously. It's not just that our understanding of so-called traditional societies is wrong, although that is painfully, obviously, I hope by now, the case. Actually, by the ways we use the terms, note it's kind of the opposite. It is kind of the opposite in the sense that if we define a traditional society as a society that accepts a single stable view of the world as naturally the case, that is a pre-given world into which we are born, And then we must simply accord with that world in order to flourish as individuals and therefore as larger societies. If that is our definition of a traditional world, we are about as prototypically traditional thinkers as you could possibly imagine. Even if, in our case, that stable world we live in, we think is predicated upon notions of free will, if you look at it from the outside, you could argue, on the contrary, it is a radical acceptance of a completely stable world with an incredibly restricted vision of humanity, a vision so restricted we actually fail to even see what we are literally doing on a daily basis and how we are making what we are mistakenly calling decisions on a daily basis, all of which we accept within our free lives, foolishly thinking that is an accurate characterization of the world we are actually living in. Whereas, on the contrary, if you take some of these other arguments seriously, the precise goal would be to say, how do we actually break down these dangerously limiting views that we have of ourselves? How would we, in other words, do precisely what is now being done in fields like physics and biology that would question these assumptions of a stable world, and how would we actually do that in terms of our ethical, social, and political lives as well? How would we really develop economic theories and political theories that would work against these dangerous tendencies we have? How, in other words, would we really actively begin doing things that go beyond simply incentive structures and motivation structures in terms of a restricted vision of humanity, but actually began seriously thinking through questions like, how do we create worlds within which humans can flourish? What would that mean? Not because we could plan out what it would mean, but what we can do is actively work to create worlds that will break these limited structures that we tend to find ourselves falling into. And if we're developing economic and political theories upon that, the implications could be huge. In short, what I would like to argue is the following. We like to think nowadays we live in a global world. I would like to argue we really, really, really do not. Rather, we have created an incredibly, incredibly dangerously restricted notion of what humans are like, what the world is like, and perhaps worst of all, what the world is that we are living in. And in that world, a view of the self, a view of what allows that self to flourish, and a view of an economic theory as well as a political theory that can explain how that self can flourish best is become so completely predominant that we have cut ourselves off from what have in fact been incredibly profound understandings that have been arising throughout world history that would fundamentally challenge some of these assumptions. And if we really wanted to live in a cosmopolitan world, what that would mean would be taking these ideas that have arisen throughout world history, a ton of them, seriously. Probably no one of them is perfectly accurate, most certainly including the ones that have become so dominant now, but by taking them seriously, allowing them to challenge our fundamental assumptions, what we're doing in practice is exactly what, in this case, these theorists from China were talking about when they were talking about ritual. You start creating these breaks, right? You start creating these breaks in our ways of thinking in which you take one assumption that we now don't even see as an assumption and take other views so seriously that you realize this is an assumption. This has led to certain ways of thinking, ways of being in the world that are incredibly dangerously restrictive. And as such, you open up other possibilities by playing them off against other ones. And that, I would say, is one of the things we could begin doing if we really started building a cosmopolitan world. A world in which ideas that happen to have arisen in what we will mistakenly call another culture, or mistakenly called a traditional world, would on the contrary be seen as possibly profound ideas from which we could learn. We would also immediately realize these ideas are not, in this example I'm giving from today, uniquely Chinese or uniquely old. Actually, versions of this appear all over the place, but we don't take them seriously anymore because they are cut off and seen as something radically other. If we really took them seriously, what I would like to suggest is the following. We potentially could develop radically different, ironically not radically new, they're in this case quite old, economic, political theories, ethical theories, that would be every bit as powerful as the cosmological theories that are now becoming slowly significant in the fields of physics and biology. Why in the world are we not doing so? Simply because, again, to use some of this terminology, we have fallen into such a restrictive set of thinking, patterns of thinking, ruts of thinking, that we are failing to see much of the world around us, failing to see the power of ideas around us, and building economic and political theories that are extraordinarily restrictive precisely because we think they and they alone are what are allowing us to be free individuals. If we take some of these other ideas seriously, truly beginning to build a cosmopolitan world, then yes, we open up the possibilities for emergence. We open up the possibilities for the emergence of new things that we could not predict. But we become able to sense the possibility of doing so, creating the conditions in which they can do so, responding to the disruptions that inevitably occur as they do so, and slowly, we actually perhaps begin creating a world that could much more be one in which humans can flourish, because we are seriously understanding a world of complexity. We are seriously recognizing the dangerous limitations of our current views of causality, and perhaps most importantly of all, we are beginning to realize the degree to which what we think of as reality is in fact a dangerously restrictive construct that we don't even recognize as such, and therefore it becomes dangerously, foolishly unable to change, even as it seems to be creating an ever dangerous world around us. And yet, since we don't realize we've constructed it and think we're living in a free world, we aren't even focusing on the problem. In short, the ideas are there. They've actually been there for a long time. And we could begin building a cosmopolitan set of theories that perhaps may allow us the possibility as human beings to truly begin to flourish in ways that we ironically are preventing ourselves from doing right now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the beautiful talk. And I was thinking that there is also the duality in terms of search for the self with a connection to the society of a person. So in one hand we have the self as the individual, which sees himself or herself as an opposition to the society. And on the other hand we have self that is part of the society, the part of the greater value, and sometimes is even eager and ready to sacrifice it for the greater goods. So I'm really curious on how it seems like it's very deeply embedded in what you are talking about, and so I would like you to hear a bit how you comment on it, and how do you think are things now in modern China, because probably everything evolved. Thank you very much.
Great, wonderful question, thank you. And yes, one of the standard ways we will often put it now is we will say, well, in the West we focus on the individual, and in the East we focus on the community. And it's a dangerous way of phrasing it in all senses of the term, as your question was implying. First of all, it divides everything into East and West, and second of all, it assumes that the West is individualistic and the East is communal. In both cases, I think it's wrong, and I think your characterization is very effective. So yes, in a way that's become a common way of thinking, not only in the West, it's now become very sadly global, would be to argue, yes, you focus on the individual, but then as you said, the individual can at a certain point therefore choose how that individual will react with the larger community, even to the point of choosing a self-sacrifice, if it can be on behalf of the community, as long as that individual is choosing. Now, in alternate ways of thinking, which again are exclusively Chinese, they've actually been pervasive in the West too at other times, then it's not simply you're focusing on the community, you're saying, let's actually break down that entire way of thinking, right? So if it's relational all the way down, you don't have an individual and then a larger society that's an aggregate of all these individuals. Rather, what you have are, to use some of their terminology, these messes of energies in every individual, but that's equally true of every individual and equally true of the larger cosmos that we find ourselves in. And then if everything is relational, the question is, what types of relationships are you building? Those relationships will, in the dangerous level, determine us, because we can fall into these ruts and patterns that we will simply repeat endlessly, so we become determined by them. Or in other relationships, you allow everything to flourish in ways that become unimaginable. Those are the two sides of the spectrum. From this point of view, then, It's a question endlessly of saying, what types of relationships are we building at every level? So economically, what types of relationships are we building by running things one way versus another way? What are the dangers of building a world in which, as we say, we'll privatize and deregulate everything to make everything work like a market? That sounds great, right? If it's a market, no one's controlling it and everyone is free. Well, from this point of view, no. The degree to which you can do that is the degree to which you create certain sets of threats and patterns that remain unbroken because you're not creating anything else that would ever be breaking them down. So from this point of view, it isn't so much individual versus community, it's relationships. And what we as individuals, to use our term, what would allow us to flourish come down entirely to these relationships. What would allow the larger community to flourish depend entirely on these relationships. And these are true from larger economic and political systems down again to mundane ways that we interact. And those become the issues of the focus. That's what we focus on ethically, socially, politically. And it raises a ton of very different questions than we tend to think of. And so, yeah, getting back to the heart of your question, what happens if we think of the relationship of the individual and the community in terms of relationships all the way down from the highest level to the lowest level? And it really leads to a completely new set of questions about then what we should be focused on. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very beautiful talk. You know, I'm coming from a family, raised up in a family, who believed that the world was messy, my father and mother. A typical Dutch Calvinistic family.
Indeed.
And there were also a lot of traditions in those years, 1950 and so on and so on. We hated these traditions.
Yes.
And because they were cold, insensitive in a way. And even my parents did not know exactly why these traditions were there. Mm-hmm. So there was a cold frame we are living in, something like that. I'm over-exercised. But I want to make a contradiction, and then I'm asking you the question.
Yeah.
So later on, we got the psychologists and the psychotherapists for getting rid of our bad manners and our behavioral patterns.
Yes.
So my question to you is, what would you prefer? Again, traditions, or would you prefer have open access to psychotherapists and coaches? And so getting it away from the parents who are doing everything wrong, of course. That's being a parent is doing things wrong. So I can imagine two systems. One is the tradition, and the other one is, the parents are getting, I am getting help of psychotherapists who help me to become a good person. Or a person who is developing itself and getting rid of its behavioral patterns. So what would you choose, you personally?
Yeah.
Would you choose for a Confucian way of life, or would you choose for a psychotherapeutical way of life?
Wonderful question. And let me pull back to give a piece of the larger argument, but I promise that I will return to the heart of your question. So to pull back, I and some collaborators put together a book on ritual theory, trying to take some of these ideas from China seriously as theory, to say how do we rethink our economic and political theories accordingly. And the argument that we came up with was to say, let's think not of the dichotomies of West and East or tradition and modernity, but let's think in terms of ritual systems and sincerity systems. The ritual system actually isn't a system, as we mentioned, but it can become one. So rituals, as we discussed before, are these attempts to endlessly create these breaks. So the danger is we fall into these ruts and patterns, and you're trying to use these to break that. From that point of view, the world is messy, it is fragmented. What it becomes depends on what we create of it, either passively or not, and the goal of rituals is to open up possibilities that we couldn't imagine. But the danger of this, as we see in a lot of the political theories that work out I suspect what for us would be the dangerous sides of this, is any ritual system can always become a system. In other words, where it ceases to be all about fragmentation and messiness, but it becomes about kind of building a coherent system where people are socialized into ways of thinking, exactly as we tend to associate with so-called traditional orders. And the reason we do is that this has certainly happened. It certainly happened in China. It certainly happened elsewhere. When that tends to happen, then you get the break elsewhere. And the break are what we call sincerity movements. These attempts to say they tend to be anti-ritual, they're all about breaking from the ritual and people becoming sincere and authentic unto themselves. And this has happened, again, we associate this as a prototypically modern move. In fact, it's happened all over world history, over and over and over again. Now, in answer to the question, what we would argue is that tension can be incredibly productive. It becomes dangerous, and obviously we're associating this with the current moment we seem to be living in, when sincerity movements become seen as the only possible alternative and are taken as literally being true. And the reason why I put it this way is, getting back to the heart of your question, a sincerity movement can be an effective break against a ritual system if it becomes a ritual system. In other words, if it becomes a system that's training people into a coherent way of thinking, from this point of view, that's very dangerous. Sincerity movements can emerge as a break from that. The dangerous thing is when people actually take it literally as being true. Like, I literally really do have this authentic self that I really should be sincere and authentic to, and everyone really does have the same. That's when it's dangerous. So getting back to the heart of your question, it's the tension that actually can be productive. Or, and again, obviously I'm coming from the ritual way of thinking when I put it this way, and I'll be honest about it, it's the breaks that matter, right? It's the breaks that matter. And if a ritual system becomes a system, it's dangerous. If a sincerity movement becomes seen as a totalizing worldview that's actually true, that's every bit as dangerous. And what you're looking for are these constant breaks. And those breaks can be anywhere. Breaks can even be in claims of the sincere individual, which at certain moments can be incredibly productive. But as we've seen, it can also become its own totalizing system that can become incredibly dangerous, at which point you need the equivalent of rituals that would, that would break this. So I would say it's the tensions that are productive. It's any time we fall into a totalizing way of thinking that we assume to be an accurate representation of the real world, that's when it becomes dangerous. And I think we have to admit, it's a huge danger that we as humans have. We tend to fall into this, and when we do, we are perhaps least able to create worlds within which we can flourish. It's the breaks that matter. It's the tensions that matter. And however we can create those, the better. So in your childhood, a successful break. It's only dangerous if one of those views wins out and becomes a totalizing system. It's a great question. Thank you.
It seems to follow very nicely, sort of segue from that. What I wanted to ask is how you see, for example, a continuous process of breaking by introducing both stimulating questions and questioning, inquiry, and, if you will, cognitive dissonance, so that one builds a system of multiple loop learning, if you will, in the sort of the educational lingo. But the point is that it becomes, do you think that that is a way that one, in a sense, builds a process in the society that continually is, and the members of the society are continually accustomed to challenging these assumptions?
Yes, I think that's beautifully put. And I think that is exactly what we need to do. And let me give, in fact, a quick contrast to a way that's becoming dangerously common, at least in America, but again, sadly not just there, and then get to the heart of your question of what we could do to counteract this. So a move that's become very common in America is to say, well, given the view that we've been discussing, that I've been critiquing, I mean, that we are all at our best, these sincere, authentic individuals, rationally choosing for ourselves what is best. From that point of view, the argument is, well, what we want to do is create situations where we are always, as much as possible, in a market situation, such that we are choosing for ourselves what is best. And then, of course, those who are best at doing that in a market situation would always be the ones moving to the top, and those who move to the top in such a situation would always be the ones best able to make decisions as to how to keep that market flowing. And so from this point of view, what you want to do, of course, is privatize, deregulate. You try to create a market in as much of the world as possible, such that the marketplace by definition is a market, but equally government is you deregulate government, you move successful business leaders into the governance structure such that government functions like to whatever limited degree it exists, like a market. You try to make the schools function like a market. So you marketize everything, thinking that will always encourage humans at their best. Now, from the point of view of that we're discussing, that was arguably the most dangerous thing we could conceivably be doing. Not that you can't create such a world. The dangerous thing is you can. And if you create such a world, what you do is you pattern and rut people into thinking of themselves as these sincere, authentic individuals trying to rationally maximize their competitive edge over everyone else. And you create a world that's based upon competition. You create humans who become increasingly narcissistic, increasingly unable to respond to the world around them, and therefore dangerously, horribly incapable of responding to larger global crises, etc. The world we're quickly creating. So, getting back to the heart of your question, I agree. What we want to do is the precise opposite of that. So what you would want to do is actually, first of all, at a larger societal level, you intentionally want to create different clusters. So if you have, for example, a marketplace functioning like a market, you intentionally want to create a divorce of that world from, say, governance structures. Within governance structures, you want to create different clusters that are interacting but actually are developing different sides of human beings. Getting back to the heart of your question, in an educational structure, what you want to do is precisely create, exactly as you said, these different clusters that are developing different sides of ourselves, and then creating structures that would be endlessly changeable according to the ways those different clusters are working out. Now, that's putting it very abstractly, but we can get very, very concrete here. What this would mean is you intentionally try to have a diverse set of curricula going on. You intentionally try to create administrative structures that are constantly responsive to what is going on around you. You constantly try to work on best practices picked from different places, but the plural being the key, because no one set of practices, no matter how successful they are ever going to work in the long run, because from this point of view, any set of practices create a set of sort of rutted patterns, and your goal is the diversity. And so if you're thinking this way, what you're constantly trying to do is create what you're saying. So in an educational system, in an organizational system, in an economic and political system, you're intentionally trying to create these clusters that precisely because of their diversity are developing different sides of ourselves. It means we as individuals, over the course of even a physical day, are operating through different clusters. That's a good thing. It means from a larger social order, you have different clusters interacting. That's a good thing. Not because any one of them are right, but they're developing different sides of human beings that in their interplay would open up the possibility for these breaks that are crucial. And so yes, your goal across the board at every level is, going back to your way of phrasing, which I love, how do you build into the organizations these breaks such that no one vision is ever completely dominant? Even if it seems to perfectly match our vision of what makes us tick as human beings, no one of them is going to be right. And so your goal precisely is prevent any one of them from dominating our lives. It's a great question. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
It was a very thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question is related to when you said that we do not live in a global world,
Yes.
but we think we do, right?
Yes.
I was thinking of how nowadays we are celebrating a lot diversity, and we celebrate all the different cultures, which are inherently different patterns that were constructed right long time ago, maybe. And there's this belief that we have to celebrate diversity, and the most tolerant societies that celebrate or incorporate more diversities are the ones who thrive the most in comparison. So there are all these theories that say diversity is a good thing. So in this case, we wouldn't be really breaking the patterns, but we would be accepting them. Right, so this is like an opposing view to what you said probably. So what do you think about this? And one second thing that is, when you said that we should actively work to create worlds in which these patterns are broken, I thought that maybe the new access to languages, maybe related to the previous talks that we have, is breaking language as a barrier so we can interact more with each other. Or for instance, how education is changing with the rise of Coursera, EDX, and all these platforms. So some patterns are being broken already. Wouldn't you think that, thanks to technology?
Yeah, great questions. I'll actually begin with the first, because that will lead perfectly to the second one. Both are excellent. So to begin with the first, Yes, except I worry it's not what we're doing. And what I mean by that is if you look at the way diversity tends to operate, it tends to mean you denude all of the so-called cultures in question of pretty much everything we've been discussing and bring them into what we think of as this perfectly proper modern way of thinking. So let me give some very concrete examples. That's an abstract way of putting it. So for example, we'll say, we want people from different religious beliefs to be able to come together and flourish. But then note in practice what we do. First of all, different things are termed as religions. By religion, we mean a coherent belief system, which means things like everything we've been discussing. So those things that are based upon these complex workings of rituals are taken out. So forget about rituals, it's all about belief. So you denude the group of having rituals. It all becomes about a spiritual set of beliefs. That's defined as a coherent religion. And then you say each of these religions should tolerate each other because basically they're all about a sincere belief in something. And even if they call that something slightly different names, it's all basically the same. So in the name of diversity, what you've really done is simply taken out ritual. You've defined everything in terms of sincere belief. Everything is about sincere belief in something higher that simply has different names. And so while you claim it's diversity, in fact, you've taken out all possible diversity. You've actually prevented what would matter, which is allowing things to interact and break patterns. Actually, you've made everything into the same thing. And then dangerously, we congratulate ourselves by saying, and look at the diverse world we've built, which is, again, horribly dangerous because we're not even realizing the degree to which, no, we've completely homogenized everything by making everything into a single thing. So my worry is, even in so-called diverse societies, in America we are certainly guilty of everything I've just mentioned, it's not really diverse at all. Like to enter into the accepted world, you have to actually become a perfectly sincere, believing individual, and then you're acceptable. Meaning that if you accept anything other than that, sincerity, the individual, the importance of ritual, all of these things, that's taken out. So that is not diversity. And then getting to the second question, yes, I think what would be real diversity would be allowing things to, again, bump off against each other, where you really are trying to learn from very different ways of understanding the self and really taking them seriously, not because necessarily each one of them is right, because you're assuming that probably no one of them is perfectly right, but in that diversity you create these constant breaks. Now, using, for example, technologies, could we do this? Absolutely. So before I was using the example of technologies that I think we are using in dangerous ways. Let me touch on that, but then get to the positive side. So clearly, a dangerous way from this point of view that we are currently using technologies is we are creating technologies that are encouraging us in our most patterned and redded aspect of our lives. So I mentioned the example before of the way advertising will work through Google. That's a perfect example, but there are others too, right? So increasingly, we're talking about creating systems where I will walk into my apartment after a hard day of work, and the computer system will have been so carefully charting my patterns, it will know, okay, Michael's in kind of a tired, exhausted mood. It always brings him up on that Thursday afternoon, just with my earlier example, if he hears a certain type of music, and so a certain type of music starts playing, and the coffee pot will start brewing coffee just because at that moment I like my cup of coffee, and that piece of music will work well with my current mood. And so in other words, we're using the technologies to simply figure out our ruts and patterns and perfectly play to them such that we'll become more patterned and more rutted. So we'll be hearing the same type of music at the exact same time every single day. So technology depends on how we use it. And if on the flip side of that, imagine we started using technology to break our patterns, to actually really begin introducing us to things that break our patterns. I'm to use that mundane example, listening to pieces of music I would not otherwise ever on my own have thought to listen to at this certain moment, but getting to the more significant examples that you brought up, where I would really be truly learning about other ideas, not by after they've been denuded into my vision of what a proper, sincere individual will be like, regardless of what they sincerely believe in, but where I would really begin learning other ideas. Could we build technologies that would allow us to do that? Absolutely. So technology isn't the problem. It actually could be extraordinary in terms of what we could do with it. It's simply, sadly, we're not using it that way. But could we? Absolutely. And I would say that would be an extraordinary thing for the next generation to really begin focusing on. Of how could we actually begin using these extraordinary technologies to break patterns and open up new possibilities? So yeah, thank you so much.
Professor Puett,
Yes.
can I congratulate you on the most beautiful defense of Confucian rituals I've ever heard. It's really wonderful, I thought. But I thought that your insight that actually, despite the modernity and the diversity, we are actually trapped into a deterministic mental map of the world that is completely wrong, right? But the irony of it all, and I would like to hear how you think about this, is because the Chinese have been struggling this for the last 3,000 years. I mean, 2,600, according to your calculations, 4th century BC. But the key question really is this, that whatever rules you put in, rituals, codes, rules you put in, you end up with a bureaucracy that itself cannot be controlled, right? And that today we have a capitalist system which has also this mental map that creates an ever-growing bureaucracy. Government has grown larger and larger and larger, that we now have a reaction in the form of Steve Bannon wanting to deconstruct the administrative state, which is exactly a reaction to a bureaucracy which nobody likes and nobody controls, right? So how, based upon your study of Chinese history, how do you think that this, can be dealt with?
Yeah, beautiful question. And I would say one of the things we need to avoid, which is exactly as your question is implying, one of the things we're falling into, is we still tend to think in terms of what is the proper ism. And what I mean by that is the following. Part and parcel of this way of thinking is we come up with what is the proper understanding of humans. In this case, it's we need to be sincere and authentic and rationally choose for ourselves. And out of that, we build a proper ism. And there have been other isms too, communism, fascism, socialism. All of these were 19th and 20th century, and I'll use the term, sincerity movements. They're all about some sincere understanding of the human self, and then you build up a belief system, a totalizing system that would perfectly create a perfect government and perfect society based upon who we really are. And as you said, one of those was dominant until roughly the 1980s. Since the 1980s, it's been largely a neoliberal vision. And so you've got a struggle of these two big isms. Before that, there were a few other isms that have sort of fallen off. But since '89, it's sort of been those have been the two that have been playing off against each other. In terms of the question, what would be the response? If we take some of these ideas seriously, one of the things we should try to do is avoid trying to come up with another ism to replace this. And then what we would say is, our goal should be precisely to say, how do you create, at a very concrete level, these different clusters that would prevent a single vision from becoming a totalizing system? So, very concretely, if right now there's a strong push toward an extreme variant of neoliberalism. So what I mean by that is, since the 1980s, the dominant view has been neoliberalism, right? So free markets across the world, etc. The latest variant we like to call a rejection of neoliberalism. Actually, what it really is a new variant of it. So what Trump basically represents is to say it's a purely neoliberal vision. He simply wants to end the global trade for the financial sector and simply say, okay, I want a neoliberalism that will simply say, we will create market environments for absolutely everything. We'll have the government run like a business. The educational system will run by the market. So everything will be a market. And then the ideology is, as you said, is we'll wipe out the administration state because that's preventing a real market from occurring. So the administrative state is actually simply empowering itself. It's preventing the market. We'll deconstruct it, as you said, and we'll make everything function like a market. So it's basically just a variant of neoliberalism. So how do we respond to this? We respond to this by saying that's precisely what we don't want. And another ism, in this case sort of a variant of an earlier ism, neoliberalism, trying to create the entire world as a market is extraordinarily dangerous. Again, as we said before, not because it doesn't work. The dangerous thing is it does. like you actually can create a world that would become so coherently focused on one vision of the self that it just becomes part of people's patterns that they behave this way. So they do become market-focused, narcissistic individuals, and you can create such a world. But that's the last type of thing we would ever want to be doing, I would argue. So what you want to do is intentionally create clusters that are constantly breaking against this. So if you have a market situation, you intentionally would want some type of government structure divorced from that would actually play against it. Now, do you want that then to be a bureaucracy that could control it? Absolutely not, because you would want that break to be there. And so you'd want to say, how would we create government institutions that would actually function like these cluster breaks, right? So they would not be part of the market, as the current push is, nor would it be a bureaucracy that would actually try to predict and control the market, equally dangerous, and really based upon the same vision of the self. So how do you actually create government structures that would be actually designed to break against a market in a productive way? And how would you actually encourage NGOs that would create other sort of clusters? They would not be part of the market, they would not be part of the government, and yet they also wouldn't be operating by the same vision of, say, incentive structures and motivation structures that our current economic theory would say they should operate by. So how do you actively begin creating those? And the reason I'm answering the question this way is it seems to me this is the direction we need to be going in, and going back to our political theorists that we've been talking about, this is how they would talk. So they would say, you're not thinking in terms of, is democracy good? Is capitalism good? Do we have an alternative to it? They would say, look, you're always born into the world as it exists. And the question is, taking the world as it exists, what do you do with it? And so in the case at hand, if the problem is we are moving toward creating a purely market-based society, how do you actively begin working against the dangers that's creating, while avoiding, as you said, any kind of a notion of a return to bureaucracy would actually control things? And that then becomes a very practical question. How do you actively create these institutional breaks? How do you actively create these clusters that begin working against each other? And when I say it's a practical and concrete question, it's because you can't predict in advance what's going to work. But what you can do is start creating these clusters, start creating these breaks, and as those breaks work, it will open up other possibilities, which will open up others. So my response in short is, we don't want another ism. What we do want to do is start actively creating these different clusters, and from there, that will open up new possibilities that we yet, at this stage, could not predict.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
So we don't want to run too long over, so we'll just have two final questions. So first there, and then later by Brian.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. My question is a little bit on the philosophical side. You had this example that you used to make a case against lack of freedom in the West, that watch example.
Yes.
And that's subliminal ad campaigns that are prevalent everywhere. So we as human beings, we are susceptible to subliminal stimuli and ads, and at the subconscious level, we are quite irrational beings. And behavioral psychologists have written books on our irrationality at that level. So my question to you is that, don't you think that we have reached to our limit for freedom, and this is as free as we can be? And although it's not absolute freedom, but it's just our limit. And if you think that we can go above that limit, how would you devise a solution to go above that? For example, would banning subliminal ad campaigns would be a solution? If that's the case, don't you think it's another authoritarian system?
Great question. And I'll actually begin with the latter point and then move to the heart of your question. So the answer is no, I agree fully. Simply a government banning a certain type of ad, as you said, that would be another authoritarian system, and it would be destructive in itself. And from these points of views, even if for some reason we supported such a thing, it would always be doomed, because any attempt to overtly dominate one thing always just leads to, to resentment and responses to break around it. So even if we thought that was a good thing, and I don't, it would be doomed anyway. So to get to the heart of your question, maybe the problem is we need to rethink freedom, right? So if we think freedom means I, as the rational individual, should be able to choose for myself based upon who I am, what is best for me, then, as you said, we've kind of hit the extreme point of that, about at least as close as we can imagine to that sort of a world. And yet, from another point of view, is this really a free world that we're living in? By that definition, absolutely, more so than perhaps has ever existed in human history. From other points of view, I would say, no. And taking some of these ideas seriously, maybe that's a flawed vision of freedom. Maybe it's a flawed vision because it seems, by definition, to be the most liberatory vision we could possibly imagine for the individual. But ironically, it could, on the contrary, be an incredibly restrictive and limited vision of the individual because it means each of us has to be limited to this one unique self that we think we have, that we therefore must preserve and always be sincere and authentic to because it's us. Well, what if we're multiple selves, right? What if we're multiple selves with multiple possibilities that we could not imagine, and what we will become over time will depend on the worlds that we are a part of and hopefully even helping to create, which, getting to the heart of your question, would say, maybe that's what we should be focusing on. So freedom then would consist of the degrees to which we are successfully able to build worlds within which we and those around us could flourish in ways that we could not imagine. We could not imagine what sorts of humans, I and those around me, could become in such worlds, but freedom would be creating such worlds. And then you're asking a slightly different question. If freedom is freedom for me to be true to myself and able to choose for myself what's best for me, you again focus on the economic and political theories that we've come to know so well. I mean, it does take you right down the road of neoliberalism. If, on the contrary, you're saying freedom is the ability to create worlds within which we can flourish, then suddenly you're pushing against a lot of what we otherwise would be thinking are precisely the things that are liberating us. And then your questions, going back to the earlier question too, come down to how do we build worlds within which those breaks become a constant reality? How do we build worlds in which the reality, therefore, becomes something that we see as something that's emergent, that we are creating? And then you're asking very different questions. And getting back to the heart of your question, the specific example of it, I mean, then would we want to stop people from running ads like that? No, definitely not. But certainly I, to stick with that example, would be very unlikely to click on that little red thing at the top of my New York Times website, I mean, if I had been able to break myself from being such a pattern creature. And if that's my concern, then over time such ads would cease because they would cease to be effective. And then I am actively helping to create worlds where, to use that example, those technologies start being developed in ways that would actually encourage a flourishing, as opposed to simply encouraging, I think, me to make my free will decisions, meaning, in practice, me simply playing out my patterns completely, unconsciously, not realizing I've become like a robot. So great, thank you. Yes.
One of the technologies that for becoming aware of your own patterns and ruts was available to the Chinese over eons, and that is meditation or yes. exploration of the inner self.
Yes.
And this must surely have a parallel narrative or thread alongside the one that you were talking about.
Yes. And yet, wonderful question. And indeed, and it's a perfect example too because of the way it's been sort of dangerously appropriated. So if you look at the way that meditation has been picked up, for example, and I'll stick with America as my example here, because it's an extreme case. There's actually a meditation center that I walk by literally on my way home, so I see this every day. And literally you walk by and on the window it says, meditation center, learn to love yourself and embrace yourself. And it's all about like doing meditation such that you'll calm yourself and not let the worries of the world get to you, and you can always be true to yourself. Now, ironically, getting back to your question, of course, meditation practices are incredibly effective, but they're designed to do the precise opposite. I mean, the reason you do meditation is they break the self. And if you've ever tried meditation, and I do encourage you to do so, but do it not thinking, oh, I'll do this to be more calm and learn to love and embrace myself. No, you will not. I mean, meditation techniques work, but they work because they break the self, and it's a very scary, horrifying process to go through, a wonderful process to go through, but what you're discovering is that what you think of as the self is actually just these dangerous patterns and ruts that have become so embedded in your way of perceiving the world and building relationships that you just think they're you, and you do meditation to break them. So it's a wonderful example that this incredible technology that is very, very effective that has been actually now appropriated in these very dangerous ways. Now, the one good side about that, I guess we could say, is so many people beginning to do it, they may, unbeknownst to them, be breaking down the self. But of course, there too, it's dangerous because, precisely because these technologies work so effectively, if you actually bring people in with a misunderstanding of what they're going to be going through with meditation, they're not being properly trained because it's a very difficult thing to go through. And you want, as the practices that existed before, people there to help train them and work them through the difficulties and kind of horrors that they'll be experiencing in an ultimately great way, but it's a very difficult experience. And the way it's being done now, I do worry. People going in thinking, I'll learn to love and embrace myself, and they're facing a very difficult several years if that's what they think they're getting themselves into. So I agree. I think it's an extraordinary technology, and I think it's a crucial example of where we need to really take ideas, and in this case practices, and take them seriously, as opposed to, and it goes back to the earlier question too, of kind of denuding them of what really matters about them. In this case, it's a ritual practice to break the self. I mean, that's what meditation really is, and as such, incredibly powerful, and yet, again, we've denuded it into all being about finding the sincere and authentic self. And so to really learn from this practice, we need to really do it, and do it in all of its chilling and horrifying power, which means we're breaking the sincere, authentic self, and that's precisely why the ritual is so incredibly effective. So yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, again.
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you.
So I'm very happy that for this first day's session, all the speakers have been extremely engaging and thought-provoking. And of course, I must not forget to pass Michael this memento of our appreciation.
Thank you
That's
so
a thumbs
much.
up from Facebook. And of course, Facebook is one of the dangers of the modern world.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, if used in the correct way.
Indeed.
Yes. So, picture.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
So that's the end of the first day of the Complexity Conference.